Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters. Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Kareem to everyone. Welcome to our Islamic courses. This next session, and the topic is Rumi's Masnavi, Quran and spirituality. I'm really honored and privileged to have our teacher, Professor Omid Safi from the US of A. It's fantastic to see everyone. Welcome. If you haven't been before, welcome. If you have been a regular to our sessions in the last week and a half or so, welcome. This is being recorded. Can I just, before I hand over and start with Professor Omid Safi, can I just request some of the housekeeping rules? Please keep your PCs or mobile phones on mute. You can show your face, that's absolutely fine. Not a problem. I can see some regular faces, Ismail, Harun, and Sheikh Husseini as well. So fantastic, guys, well done. It is being recorded, so it will be on a YouTube channel. We'll send you the link straight after our recording. So don't worry if you didn't get a chance to stay for the whole session. We'll try and make sure you will get it. As long as you've left your email address with us, you've registered, or you just leave your email address on the chat, we'll send you a link. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to start the session. Let me just say, Assalamu alaikum, Professor Omid. How are you? I have to unmute you. Can you hear me now? Yes, now we can hear you. How are you?
All right. Wa alaikum assalam wa Ramadan Mubarak to all the friends from wherever you happen to be joining us from.
Fantastic. And where are you in the States at the moment?
I am in North Carolina, a state that's about halfway between Washington, D.C. and Florida.
Beautiful, beautiful, fantastic. Well, welcome. Thank you so much. We're really honored and privileged and grateful that you've taken out time to come to our Zoom session and to fill us your knowledge and barakah on this very important subject, very important subject about Maulana Rumi's Masnavi, Maulana Rumi himself, Masnavi, and the Quran and spirituality, the most important topics one can think of right now, especially in the month of Quran, right? Month of spirituality, month of reflection, whatever you want to say. So without further ado, I just want to introduce people to Professor Omid. Professor Omid is a leading Muslim public intellectual from the US. He's the director of the Islamic Studies Center at University, and he specializes in contemporary Islamic spirituality. He's the chair for mysticism group at the American Academy of Religion, which is one of the largest, if not largest, organizations devoted to academic religion. He's an award-winning teacher from various universities, and he has committed to intersection of love and justice, in particular, he was invited recently by the family of Martin Luther King. He's written many volumes and many journals and many books on various subjects, including understanding Islam, rooted in gender equality, social justice, works on politics and knowledge, pre-modern Islam, etc., etc., etc. His recent book, Radical Love, Gems from Islamic Mysticism Tradition, from Yale University Press, was launched. We'll try and touch and talk about. Professor Omid has been a frequent sought-after speaker in the American media, New York Times, Newsweek, NBC, BBC, and various international. He also leads, which is something very important. After this session, we want people to go. He leads spiritual-oriented tours to Turkey and Morocco, open to all faiths, backgrounds, and age groups, illuminatingtours.com. But also, there are some online sessions, advanced, intermediate, advanced, basic sessions on Masnavi, Maulana Rumi, and various other related subjects. So welcome, Professor. Thank you. I hope that introduction wasn't over the top, but it sort of summarized everything I can see at work. So welcome.
Alhamdulillah, it's lovely to be with you and with your friends here.
Great. So, without further ado, with the format of, just for our folks right now, the format of our session is really going to be the next 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes or so. We're going to be talking about Rumi and the Masnavi and the Quran in relation to spirituality, and I've got some questions, and we'll go through these questions. And after that, we will take questions from the floor as well. You have an opportunity to ask questions, no problem. We prefer everyone to write their questions on the chat. So if there are duplications of questions, we'll just answer. One question will be taken, and if you later on, if we do get a chance, you want to take it from the screen, that's absolutely fine as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to yourself, and Bismillah. For the benefit of the audience, we do have an assumption most people do know about who Maulana Rumi was and what the Masnavi was. But very briefly, who was Maulana Rumi, or what is in the Masnavi, and then moving on to the next one, what school of spirituality, Islamic spirituality, does Maulana Rumi come from, and how does he describe his relationship to Bismillah?
Bismillah. Thank you so very much. Well, it's always an honor to get to speak about these transformative teachings that come really from the ihsan dimension of Islam and the vast ocean of the Islamic tradition. And Maulana Rumi is, without a question, one of the Muslim sages whose life and whose teachings and whose barakah has been the most instrumental in the history of Islamic civilization. He's one of those rare figures whose impact can be felt on multiple important centers of Muslim civilization historically. To begin with, in the Turkish world, he lived in what is today Turkey, and is buried there, and his shrine in the city of Konya receives about 1.5 million pilgrims a year. It is hard to fathom any variety of the Ottoman Muslim experience in a way that has not been perfumed, if you would, by the teachings of Maulana Rumi. In the Persian-speaking world, by which we don't just mean the contemporary Iranian context, but wherever the Persian language was an important literary mode of refinement and Islamic education, it has oftentimes been said that every Persian home would have 3 volumes in it. There would be the copy of the Quran, there would be the Masnavi of Maulana Rumi, and there would be the Divan of Hafiz. And someone like Shahab Ahmad, who spent his whole life traveling to different manuscript collections, has documented very beautifully how we have more manuscripts of Maulana Rumi and Hafiz than any other Muslim text, with the exception perhaps of course, the Quran. And a scholar no less than Anne-Marie Schimmel has talked about how the impact of Maulana Rumi on the subcontinent was perhaps even greater than the impact that Rumi has on Turkey. So one small measure of the influence that the Masnavi has in terms of Islamic thought is through 2 very brief anecdotes. The word Masnavi, as I'm sure the audience would surely know, simply refers to a genre of literature in which every line rhymes by itself. So the rhyming pattern would be A, B, B, C, C, and so on. It's the easiest way to write an epic, long poem. And within the Persianate and the Turkish world, the word Masnavi used to be a generic name. It simply referred to the genre of a rhyming couplet. After the time of Maulana Rumi, the word Masnavi becomes a proper noun. So within this context, if you hear someone saying, oh yes, I'd like to read you a line from the Masnavi, they're referring to Maulana Rumi's. It's almost as if he's trademarked that particular genre. He's become the very epitome. To go back again to our friend Shahab Ahmad, the late and much missed scholar of Islamic studies, he says that when we think about Islamic studies and the interpretive tradition of Islam as something that takes place at multiple sites across a society, probably no text outside of a madrasa context, has so shaped Muslims' intimate relationship with the Quran as the Masnavi has. Maulana Rumi refers to his own text, the Masnavi, as the Kashaf al-Quran, the unveiler of the inner mysteries of the Quran. A word that I made up some time ago is that it might be among the most Quranful of all the modes of Islamic literature. By some accounts, there are over 3,000 references to the Quran in his poetry. Some of the books that you see behind me are devoted entirely to tracing the presence of the Quran and the Hadith tradition in Rumi's poetry. And I think the last thing that I will say about the influence that Maulana Rumi has had on Islamic civilization is he represents one of the only figures who has had such an impact on Islamic thought that we developed entire academies devoted purely to the proper recitation and interpretation of his text. So we had a whole institution in Ottoman society, for example, and a class of people called MASNAVI Khan, the proper reciters of the Masnavi, who were the masters of not only reciting the Masnavi, but also interpreting the Masnavi. And we would have academies everywhere from Anatolia to Jerusalem to Baghdad to Cairo and Bosnia, where the Masnavi was the text of the entire curriculum. And people would be devoting their life to going as deep as possible into the Islamic tradition through the gateway of the Masnavi. So that's just a little starter for his impact and ways that we could talk about it. He's had a very interesting afterlife by now having become perhaps the best-selling poet by some reckoning in a particular permutation in Europe and North America.
Fantastic, great. If you can give some examples, besides how does he describe the relationship with the Quran? For example, how he approaches the Quran, and what's his relationship? What's his relationship to the Prophet?
Yeah, of course. So, I've been working on a whole series of classes. I would invite the audience, if they're interested in these kinds of examples, to go and look into it. We have a whole website called Illuminated Courses, and the featured course right now is on Maulana Rumi and the Masnavi. So I'll give you one example, maybe two. The way that Maulana Rumi talks about the Quran is that the figures that we come across in the Quran represent simultaneously both historical personalities, right? So there was an actually Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam, Hazrat Musa alayhi salam, Hazrat Nuh alayhi salam, and so on and so forth. And they also correspond to faculties and tendencies inside of our own being. So for example, when you're reading the story of Moses and the Pharaoh in the Quran, the account of which is of course known not only through the Quran, but also through the entire vast tradition of Qisasul Anbiya and the Tafsir tradition, Rumi stops his storytelling and saying, well, you're looking at the Pharaoh as this tyrannical figure in the story. What is it in your own being that occasionally acts like a Pharaoh? In the Masnavi, in the lessons that we're offering, he does the same thing in the story of Ashab Kahf, the companions of the cave narrative. The narrative is quite well known, of course. It has an origin in the apocryphal Christian tradition. It shows up in the Quran and is developed even more fully in the Tafsir tradition. As Maulana is telling you that story, he pauses again, as is so often his tendency, and he turns to you as the reader, and he goes, the companions of the cave are here and now before you. Do you not see them? So there's this constant tendency that he has to look at the Quran as both an account of religious figures from their own time period in the past, and as corresponding to spiritual tendencies inside our own being here today.
Great. And how would you say his relationship with the Prophet? How would you describe it?
Well, this is, of course, the most beautiful of questions. Within his own lifetime, Maulana Rumi was referred to as, in this beautiful phrase, Farzand Jan Mustafa. He is the offspring of the soul of the Prophet. The offspring of the soul of the Prophet. In many of his poems, he refers to himself as the entire goal of the spiritual path in Islam is to be, as he calls it, Muhammadi, Muhammad-like, or Muhammadvar, to take upon oneself the qualities of the Prophet. He uses this beautiful metaphor in some of his writings to talk about the tree of prophethood, the Shajaratul Anbiya. And he loves to use the metaphor of fruit that ripen and sweeten the more they're exposed to the sun. And he uses the analogy that, yes, it's true that all of the prophets come from the same tree. They all bear the same message. But what is important is that since the Hazrat Payghambar, since the Prophet, peace of God be upon him, is the last of the prophets to be revealed onto this earth, he has stayed on that tree the longest, and therefore he's the sweetest. Obviously, he's speaking here as a Muslim. And another way that he talks about the Prophet is that he says, we are the sages of the Muslim tradition, those who seek the life of the path of love and the path of illumination. He says, we are the champions of love and the intimate friends of Ahmad. The champions of love and the intimate friends of Ahmad. Pahlevan ishq va yar Ahmadim. So I think this is at least some of the ways. And in the lessons that are online, I've gone through one entire lesson in which we talk about the beautiful way in which he reinterprets the commonly known story of the Mi'raj, the heavenly ascension, and casts it as how you need to have both an intellectual life, but also a love-based life in order to enter the proximity of the divine. And that's probably my favorite way that he relates to the Prophet, and I would invite people to go and look into that.
Fantastic. And could you give us examples of how he approaches the Quran? I mean, I know we mentioned, the way the MASNAVI is written and the stylistic, and because a lot of people, there's a lot of criticism, but a lot of times they don't really understand the way it's written, how it's written, why it's written the way it is, and why some people say, look, there are more verses here than the Quran itself. But what does that mean?
Yeah, beautiful. To begin with, when you take a look at the commentary tradition on the MASNAVI, and for the purposes of this course that we're offering, I went through about 15 different commentaries that have been written on the MASNAVI in Iran, in the Ottoman Empire, in Central Asia, and elsewhere. So just to begin with, we know that the last few surahs of the Quran end with the command qul, say, and the MASNAVI begins with the word bishnu, which is listen. So many of the commentaries talk about the MASNAVI dovetails the Quran. The Quran commands you to say or to speak and the Quran does, and then the Masnavi invites you to receive that same message by hearing and listening. I'll give you one short example that might be helpful for people of how he interprets it. Again, what's so intriguing about Maulana Rumi is that contrary to the way that sometimes he is depicted and presented in Western popular consumption, we present Maulana as a mountain that appears by himself, as if he's not a part of a tradition. And I always try to remind people that no, he is a sweet fruit of a 500-year tradition of Islamic thought and spirituality. He is drawing very much on the teachings of sages that have come before him, even as he adjusts their interpretation.
He's a very orthodox scholar, you would say, because there's a perception of Rumi and all the other things that comes along with it. But when you say he's orthodox as you can get, to study and in tradition.
Right. I wrote a whole book on the development of the concept of orthodoxy in Islam under the Seljuks. So that word is a little complicated, as I like to say. Orthodoxy is always something that is contested in some ways. I would say that he views himself as someone who is deeply attached to the Quran and to the very being of the Prophet. We've got these wonderful stories that one of his students comes to him and asks him for some spiritual advice. So this is, it's an easy thing. Just advise me, give me nasiha. And he says, why should I? You've read the Quran, you didn't take it to heart. You have read the life of the Prophet, you didn't take that to heart. Why should I think that my words would be taken to your heart? So in that way, he is always returning people to the Quran and the life of the Prophet. I think one reminder that I also have is sometimes when we use the word orthodox, there's a certain measure, intended or not, of dryness that is implied in it. There's even a hint of the straight and narrow path.
Right.
Whereas Maulana Rumi, I think, represents someone who is lovingly orthodox. So he's always trying to return you to the realm of the heart, to the realm that God looks at your interior actions, even though in his daytime, he's teaching Islamic law in a madrasa.
Right.
So he loves to use Quranic terminology and legal language to return you to this path of the heart. And the example that I'll give people, and again, in our course, we've got dozens and dozens of these kinds of things to take you deeper, is, there's that wonderful series of verses, يا أيها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. And we so often think of this as this is the nafs al-mutma'inna, this is the tranquil soul, this is the peaceful soul that has gone beyond the binaries of nafs al-ammara and nafs al-lawwama, the blaming self and the self that commands you to evil, and it has reached that state of serenity, of tranquility, and it is that state of the soul, the nafs al-mutma'inna, that can enter into the garden, enter into paradise. But there's been, even before the time of Maulana Rumi, a wonderful way of reading that verse, which is the last part of it say, Fadkhuli fi abadi, wadkhuli jannati, come on in, my servants, my devotees, and you've entered my garden. And for at least 300 years before the time of Maulana Rumi, there have always been a group of Muslims who have interpreted that verse not only as, so come on in, comma, oh my devotees, but quite literally as Fadkhuli fi ibadi. So enter into my devotees and you have entered my garden. They've taken the fi literally as going into the ibadi. And Maulana Rumi carries on that tradition. So in the course of the Masnavi, first in Arabic and then in the Persian translation, he has about 20 different places where characters are speaking with one another and they say to each other either Fadkhuli or Andaro, which is an invitation to enter the heart of an illuminated being, of a sage. And when you're taken into that person's heart, in the last story in the Masnavi, for example, Imam Ali speaks with a pagan warrior in that language.
Why do you think you wrote such a great masterpiece? I mean, do you think it was trauma because of running away from the Mongols and he settled in that part of Turkey or Anatolia, and then hence he had to be, you know, what he saw in the trauma of of all the things, he thought this is the way forward. We have to love everyone. And
as a rigorous historian, I think my answer would be that it is called baraka. He was given the gift, and you know, sometimes you hear these accounts that Ibn al-Arabi was said to have written 780 pamphlets or books. And with Maulana Rumi, I mean, with the Masnavi itself, it's almost 30,000 lines. And he talks about this experience of poetry pouring out of him. And his companion, Hussam, whose task it is to write it down, he's like, just a little slower. I can't keep up with you. And I think some of us have had this blessing in life of being around people whose life carries a kind of overflowing of barakah, where everything that they have studied, and Maulana has spent, he grew up at the feet of his father, who is a famous alim himself, who is a famous Sufi himself. He studied with different masters, but then there's something about not being content with mere intellectual journey, but also taking it to heart, that makes him who he has become.
Fantastic. And so you could say, so after Rumi, what happened? I mean, was the Masnavi taken by the madrasas and the sultan, various sultans, madrasas, and then, you know, could you explain what was the impact of the Masnavi on the Ottomans or on the Muslim Islamic in general?
It had a twofold presence. Within the Ottoman realm, which of course, like all the other Muslim realms in the pre-modern context, there was a very rich presence of Sufi communal life. And the Masnavi became the central piece of the Mevlevi, the Mawlaviya tradition. And the Mevlevis always had a very intimate relationship with the Ottoman sultans. So there becomes a very long-standing tradition of commissioning the copying of the Masnavi, commentaries on the Masnavi. And sadly, given the ways in which our contemporary political contexts are tied to a nationalistic tradition, you know, when we think of the Ottomans, we think of Turkey and we think of the Turkish language. Yes. When we think about Pakistan, we might think about Urdu. And we forget about the fact that from Bengal to Bosnia, that the literary language was Persian. We forget about the fact that there were many, many more Persian texts written in South Asia than there were ever written in Iran. Interesting. And we forget about the fact that it takes almost 300 years for there to be a complete Turkish translation of the Masnavi, because the Ottomans didn't need Persian translations, Turkish translations. If you were an Ottoman scholar, it was expected that you would be trilingual, that you would speak Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and Persian.
And you would read the text,
and you would read the Masnavi in the original. And many of them, of course, remember that many of the Ottomans come from non-Muslim birth backgrounds. Yeah. So many of them would have actually been indigenous Greek-speaking or Armenian-speaking, so they're actually quadrilingual of scholars. And so I think on one hand, you've got the Ottoman legacy that is carrying the the MASNAVI into the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got the South Asian reception, right? Think about how almost every South Asian person, it's almost a cliche, they will talk about, well, I don't speak Persian anymore, but my grandfather loved to cite Maulana Rumi and Sadi and Hafiz, and they knew dozens and dozens of lines by heart.
Fantastic. And, you know, the work you're doing in reviving Rumi's legacy, it's been translated, obviously interpreted in various contexts, but how have non-Muslims attempted to approach Rumi's Muslim identity? Because obviously, Rumi is one of the most popular books in America, from what I gather. And
That's
so,
right.
leading on to that, how are Muslims to claim Rumi's legacy today, and how does the study of Rumi really, where do we take it? Because obviously, you know, there's a lot of challenges, and I mean, obviously, this is just a very short session. We can't do everything.
Of course. Well, in brief, I think the case of Maulana Rumi is a wonderful study on what has happened to this rich treasure of Islamic spirituality to which we are the heirs of. This has been a treasure that has been handed down chest to chest, heart to heart to us down the centuries. And we are in danger of not cherishing this tradition. There's a few reasons for that. To begin with, we know that the spiritual dimension of Islam comes under a heavy critique from two separate wings. On one hand, Muslim modernists who want to prioritize a hyper-rationalistic understanding of reality that actually comes from the Enlightenment era. And then on the other hand, a Salafi and even more aggressively Wahhabi kind of interpretation that sees interpretations of Islam that have been developed past a certain point as being quite suspect, and certainly would view things that are developed in the non-Arabic tradition as being quite suspect. So that's on one hand, that you've got a Muslim detachment from the riches of our own tradition. And then at the same time, there is a European and Orientalist appropriation of Rumi, which takes place in two different ways, which support one another. So, on one hand, you've got the task of Orientalist scholars, great scholars who in many ways have spent their entire life studying Arabic and Persian and Ottoman and other great Muslim languages. The main European scholar who translated Rumi, for example, R.A. Nicholson, would be counted amongst them. Many of these Orientalists are committed Christian missionaries themselves who are persuaded of the superiority of the Christian tradition over the Muslim tradition.
Interesting.
And when they read the powerful love tradition within Islam of Maulana Rumi and Hafiz and Sadi and Nizami and Attar and Sana'i, and it goes on, they're overwhelmed by the beauty of this tradition. So they have one response, which is, yes, Maulana Rumi is beautiful, but he's beautiful in spite of being Muslim, not because of being Muslim.
Right.
And when you look at the explanations that many of the Orientalists write, that's a trope where they're constantly trying to reduce the Sufi dimension to the Greek tradition, the Christian tradition, the Zoroastrian tradition, the Hindu tradition, anything other than what the Sufis say is their inspiration, which is the Quran, and not only the hadith of Hazrat Paygambar, but the very being of the Prophet. And then to finish that thought and to put a cap on it, to make it worse, you nowadays also have what I would call a New Agey appropriation of Maulana Rumi that sees him as being a floating, disembodied, universal mystic that has no roots in any tradition. And so every day I get probably 20 different emails from people that have seen some Facebook quote or some meme attributed to Maulana Rumi. And it pains me because they love these poetry. Sometimes they've been reciting them in their weddings and in other contexts. And I just have to tell them, you know, either it's
or
fake
Instagram
and
tags
made up, exactly, or the more tragic thing is that all the references to the Quran and the being of the Prophet have been washed out of it. So in terms of what can and should be our response to this as Muslims, one of the things that I say, and look, I'm about as anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist as they get. That's my own politics.
Obviously, because
but
you're invited by, you know, what is it? Some of the revolutionists in America, you know.
Yeah, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and that whole radical tradition of critique. But the thing that I always say to people is that as Muslims, we have no business complaining about other people appropriating our sages unless we take our own treasures seriously. If this is our treasure, if this has been what's been handed down to us, then we should cherish it. We should value it. We should be teaching our children. The name of Maulana Rumi should be coming up in our madrasas and our academies and our khutbahs as frequently as the name of Imam Ghazali or any other great Muslim sage. And if we don't hear his treasures being echoed inside our own community, we should not be surprised that other people are stealing our treasures.
Fantastic, that is brilliant. And before we open up for questions and answers, can I just remind everyone, I know everyone's phones or computers are on mute. We are recording it, so if you didn't get a chance to see the beginning session, we'll send you the link. If you've registered, you know, fantastic. So if you haven't registered, just leave your email address on the chat. Before I hand over to questions from the chat on the floor, just some takeaways. I mean, obviously this is a Ramadan, and I obviously want to be reading the Quran that's given, but also some of us maybe want to read the MASNAVI at the same time, whether it's in English or in Farsi. What advice would you give? And
thank you.
Please, and maybe if you could, if you have a chance, maybe some verses you could just recite from, just to get people excited for your courses coming up.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, one of the things that I was thinking of was this is such an unusual season of Ramadan. And for so many of us, this is not only a time of spiritual rejuvenation, it is also a time to be in very regular connection and contact with our families, with our loved ones. And there's a barakah in the sense of being together and observing. And because of the very strange situation of the coronavirus and COVID-19, so many of us are finding ourselves in quarantine. So part of what I did was that, you know, I took the last 30 days or so and I recorded these whole series of classes on the MASNAVI. There's about 12 of them. They're pre-recorded. They're on our website, Illuminated Courses.
I'll write it down and send it to the people as well.
Yeah, illuminatedcourses.com. And people can watch them at their own time, at their own pace. And what it does essentially is to take people bit by bit through the lessons of the MASNAVI. And I think the main point that I try to make for people is that this is not, just as the Quran is not a random series of verses, the MASNAVI also has a structure. And the structure of the MASNAVI, basically, is that it begins with humanity where we are, in a state of brokenness and experiencing a sense of separation from the Almighty. And it takes you on the path of love, and you end up in that state of being a realized human being, a full and complete human being. And it transforms you not only spiritually as an individual, but also in terms of your relationship with your fellow human beings. So I'll give maybe a couple of, since you asked for a reminder.
Yeah, what are we looking forward towards when we go?
Yeah, sure. And let me see if I can maybe share a part of my screen here. And if I can, maybe that would be helpful. You all, can you all see this this MASNAVI pages at this point? Yep. So this is, by the way that the MASNAVI would be illuminated in the traditional kind of accounts. You would see the same type of artwork that would go into illuminating the Quran. This is that wonderful technique of tazhib that would be used for it. And it starts, so this is the Arabic introduction. The MASNAVI is in 6 books, and every book of it begins with an Arabic introduction. هذا كتاب المثنوي. This is the book of the rhyming couplets, the MASNAVI. وهو أصول الدين. It is the root of the root of the root of the faith. And when you read the commentaries, you see that Maulana is not only talking about usul ad-din in the way that we traditionally tend to think about it, but that this is also a tree metaphor. And he's asking you to reflect on the fact of what is the root of your faith? What are you grounded in? And whatever you ground yourself in, what is that in turn rooted in? And then again, what is that in turn rooted in? And then to think about the fact that the roots of a tree give it 2 elements. They root you, they anchor you, they ground you on one hand. And then on the other hand, they nourish you. So you don't want to become a dry tree, a brittle tree. You want to be a well-nourished tree. And this is one of his favorite metaphors. And that's why I sometimes say that it's not enough to describe Maulana as simply an orthodox Muslim. We have to go more and to say he's a loving and orthodox Muslim, because he has such a critique of a kind of dry religiosity. A lot of us can think of people who do all the right namaz and salat. They know and they believe all the right things, but there's nothing moist and tender and loving and gentle about them, right? And so he's saying that, yes, be rooted and have a spiritual life that is supple and is nourished and is sane. And then, fi kashf asrar al-wusul wal-yaqeen, in unveiling the secrets of union and certainty. Fi kashf asrar al-wusul wal-yaqeen. And what I remind people, and again, in the lessons that we have on illuminated courses, we go into much greater length and depth in these. But I remind people that this term, kashf, unveiling, this has nothing to do with veiling and unveiling and hijab politics of today. That kashf was the Sufi metaphor for removing what is veiling you from Allah. And that the great Sufis 300 years before Maulana Rumi, like Hujviri, are writing books called Kashful Mahjub, the unveiling of the veiled beloved. Fi kashf asrar, and asrar, yes, it's secret, but the sir is also the name for Sufis of the innermost layer of the heart. So Maulana, in the first line, he's asking you to go deep inside your own being, find out what grounds you and what nurtures you, so that you can have an unveiling of the divine secret. And particularly nowadays, an analogy that I use for people, remember that this is the literal meaning of the word apocalypse. A lot of us are using and seeing the world in which we live right now as the end of the world as we knew it. You can't go outside the house, you can't travel, you can't embrace your friends. And yet there is something that does feel like the end of the world. But remember that the word apocalypse originally meant kashf. Apocalypse in the Greek Christian usage originally meant unveiling. So we have to unveil and go beyond this shallow, superficial level of seeing life and reality and ourselves and even Allah into the secrets, into the inner secrets. And maybe I'll just kind of end by showing this image. I know there's some questions also about translations and things like that.
Sure.
But these are the kinds of Persian and Turkish manuscripts and of the MASNAVI that were produced. This takes the collaboration of multiple kinds of artists working together, the calligraphers and the illumination masters working together. And these are some of the really great treasures of Islamic art and spirituality. And I, as much as anybody else, love to have stolen PDFs of Russian websites. But it's one thing to have a PDF of black ink on a white page. It's another thing to remember that quite literally in our tradition, when we would draw the MASNAVI or do calligraphy for the Quran, that the colors that would be used,
yes,
that the cobalt blue represents the heaven and the gold represents the sun and illumination. So to look even upon the colors that they would use would be a reminder that what is inside of us has to become illuminated.
Amazing, beautiful. Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. Right. We've got a lot of questions, alhamdulillah. So, bismillah. So the way we're going to do the questions, if people don't mind, to make it easy. And again,
I'm happy to go through the translations and try to answer a few of them as I see, if that's helpful. So, there's a bunch of the questions that are about translation and the issues of translation. So there are a number of colonial era translation. I see people are asking about the Winfield translation and what have you. Those are not particularly reliable translations. Nicholson's is a painfully literal translation. There's a brilliant phrase in which his student uses for him. He says, "No concession has been made to readability." Right? I love that. No concession has been made to readability. In contemporary translations, there are two good ones that are out there. There is the Oxford translation by Javed Mujaddidi, which is in a rhyming, quite elegant English. And Alan Williams has recently published an expensive but quite good bilingual edition. There you go. I think one of our friends is holding up that copy as well. So those are, I think, the two best contemporary one. I would say, having spent a good 30 years or so going through the different translations of the MASNAVI, the real issue is not just translating the MASNAVI accurately and making sure that the references to the Quran and the Prophet are brought out. The real challenge in some ways is actually talking about how the stories of the MASNAVI connect to one another. Maulana really does see the MASNAVI as having this journey of the soul. And that's the main point that I've been trying to convey to people in the illuminated courses that we have. You see how there is a journey, and the journey is not just of the stories, it's the journey of your own soul. Maulana Rumi's son, named Sultan Balad, writes a whole book that I've got back here on his father's legacy. And people ask him, why did you feel like you had to write this? And he says, because people are stupid. I felt that I had to write this book because when people are reading Baba's works, they think that he's talking about a king and a maiden and a smith and an Arab and his wife. They don't understand that you yourself are the king, you yourself are the maiden, you yourself are the smith, you are the Arab, and you are the wife. These are all inside you. So in in those lessons, and I've broken it down so that people can watch one every day or the other day as they have time for them. By the way, since many of us come from immigrant backgrounds and we love a good deal, there is a promotion code for the holy month of Ramadan, and it's Ramadan, so they can enter that as well. I would recommend for people to stay away from some of the Coleman Barks translations unless they're reading them as inspired poetry, but not necessarily a scholarly work or a literal translation. Coleman takes a lot of liberties, and he's working with those previous kinds of translations. There's a couple of questions about Iqbal, Allama Iqbal, which is of course fascinating, and Iqbal is both an ocean unto himself, and also sometimes it's difficult to disentangle him from all the politics of the South Asian world, and particularly in light of his attributed role as the genealogical intellectual behind the creation of Pakistan. Here's what I would say. Probably the best assessment about Iqbal is brilliant poet, first-rate Urdu poet, first-rate Persian poet. The complicated thing about Iqbal is that he is equal parts Nietzsche and Rumi. And for my own personal taste, I wish there was a little bit less Nietzsche in him. His, especially the Asrar Khudi is a lovely reminder. Muslims, of course, love to read the Shikwa. I wish we would spend as much time reading the Jawab Shikwa as well. So that. There's one other very good question about what's the relationship of Maulana Rumi to this earlier path called, which I've called and Maulana himself calls, the path of radical love. I think that's a really important question. So this is the legacy that in Muslim languages we would refer to by the term ishq, as distinct from the other term hub or mahabba. So, I used this metaphor before of many people treat Maulana as a freestanding mountain on his own. And I always remind people that the greatest of the mountains don't appear solitary. They're part of a mountain range. So think about Mount Everest, which might be the tallest mountain in the world, but it's also a part of the Himalayas. And these other mountains are supporting it, propping it, and pushing it towards ever higher and higher heights. And it's the same way with Maulana Rumi. He comes out of not only the legacy of the Quran and the very being of Hazrat Payghambar, but also out of a 300-year Sufi tradition that is specifically devoted to ishq. So a couple of years ago, I put together this book called Radical Love, which is an anthology of the verses from the Quran and the Hadith, particularly Hadith Qudsi passages that show up in figures like Maulana, plus what's on the cover is the older figure that you would see on this side. That's Ahmad Ghazali. A lot of us, and understandably so, are familiar with Imam Ghazali, Abu Hamid Muhammad Ghazali. We forget that when Imam Ghazali has his famous intellectual crisis and he runs away to go figure out, how do I know what I know? How do I know what I think I know? The person who takes over for him at the Nizamiya, which is at that point in time more prestigious than Oxford and Cambridge are put together. The Nizamiya is simply the most prestigious university system in the Muslim civilization at that time. And Imam Ghazali has the highest post in the Nizamiya. And then when he leaves, it's Ahmad Ghazali who takes over. So what does Ahmad Ghazali do? Ahmad Ghazali literally writes the book on Ishq. He writes the first Persian book on Ishq called the Savaneh. And this is the legacy out of which Maulana Rumi comes from. So one of the things that I've tried to do, again, in my own teaching, and yes, in this illuminated courses, is to talk about how does he draw upon the teachings of these earlier Muslim sages? How do the teachings of Ahmad Ghazali and also Imam Ghazali show up in the MASNAVI and in Rumi's courses?
Okay, we've got a question from Ismail who wants to say. Ismail, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you, Professor Safi, for this beautiful talk.
Alhamdulillah.
I got the chance a few years ago to live, by the way, in Konya for about 1.5 years.
MashaAllah.
So anyway, it sounds like me that Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi is competing, in a sense, with traditional dialectical theology, Islamic theology, kalam. In some pages of the Masnavi, he argues kind of against the way of understanding Islam with reason. And in the pages that you have shown, the writer argues that this is the usul al-din. Usul al-din means kalam. So it sounds like that there is the competition has a resonance in these pages. So what's your take about this, I wonder? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, wonderful question. So I think what I would say is it's a competition only if a person sees it as a competition. What I find so fascinating and interesting is that the greatest of the Muslim scholars, they would switch register. They would code switch. They understood the necessity for different Islamic discourses. And so with Maulana Rumi, in the daytime, he would be teaching fiqh in a madrasa, and we have his collection of his Friday sermons, for example, right? So he can give a very traditional sermon, and then at nighttime, he would be switching to love poetry. And I think what's also really important, particularly for those of us who are academics, is Western academia rewards us for specialization and hyper-specialization. At its worst, we become like animals that have to urinate around a certain territory to mark it as our own, to make sure that whenever people think of that field, they associate it with our expertise. But go back and read someone like Hodgson, right? They talk about one of the beauties of Islamic thought in the classical era was the interpenetration of thought.
Yes.
So for example, the ways in which, of course, we do have ilm of kalam, we do have Aristotelian thought without a hint of mysticism in it, but the legacy of Ibn Sina and the legacy of mysticism become blended together in an Ishraqi illuminationist tradition in the East. And the same thing is true with the ways that Sufi poetry shows up in many places far outside the traditional confines of a tariqa system. I'm personally very attracted to the interpenetration and the cross-pollination of Islamic thought in these different genres and fields.
Amazing. Professor, just out of interest, has anyone translated those khutbas?
No.
maybe it's just something you could do. Have you found something interesting in the khutbahs, in the Masnavi and his khutbahs?
I do. You know, the collection of this is especially, I think, fruitful if we think of Maulana Rumi as being this, as call him sometime, new age hippie, free love kind of a figure. There is a place that in the same collection of khutbahs, also the same volume contains his letters. His son comes to him. And his son is apparently sees himself as being trapped in what he describes as a loveless marriage. And he says, Baba, you're always teaching about love. You're always teaching about ishq. Well, guess what? I found ishq, but with this other woman who's not my wife. So if your madhab is the madhab of ishq, if your path is a path of love, shouldn't I go and find ishq with this other woman? And Maulana writes a response to him. It's published in that same book of khutbahs and letters. And he says to him, my dear son, the light of my eyes, Noor Cheshmam, don't do it, don't do it, don't. What you seek is a mirage. You think it is a fresh water in the middle of the desert, but it is only dry sand that will leave you dying of thirst. Don't do it. Every bit of the love that you seek is at home waiting for you. And then he ends the letter with this line, which is like total mic drop, walk away kind of a line. He says, return to your wife and your children, free your father of worrying about you so that I can return to praying for you.
Amazing.
And I think these are also some of the dimensions of Maulana Rumi that I would wish for those of us who love him so much to also bring to light, to say that, you know, yes, the same figure who is taking love to the highest of the zeniths and literally saying that love is your mi'raj. The same one is also telling you, but this is not a license for straying from your familial obligations.
Fantastic. We're coming towards the end. One final question I think we can take was the one on children. How do you teach children?
Well, you know, what's so great about Maulana Rumi is that he has a fantastic sense of humor. And unlike some Muslim sages who are so caught up in highfalutin metaphysics that it becomes almost impossible, forget children, even to convey it to educated masses out there, Maulana sees the luminous in the everyday. So one of the things that has been really touching my heart is the number of families who have been writing me and saying that they've been sitting down and watching these lessons on the Masnavi that I've recorded with their kids. And everybody feels like they can get something out of them. And maybe I'll just leave you with this and we'll wrap it up. There's a wonderful story in the Masnavi. One of the lessons is about this specific story. And in those days, the streets were not paved. Every street was a dirt road. And when animals would go, they would be relieving themselves. So he talks about he's walking by the street and there's a puddle of donkey urine left on the path. And then there's a piece of straw that has floated from a field, landed on the middle of this puddle of donkey urine. And then there's a fly that comes and lands on that piece of straw. And then the wind comes and the wind is blowing the straw from one side of the puddle of piss to the other. And the fly, and of course in the Masnavi, all the characters speak from Zaban Hal, from this other language. And the fly is singing a song, I'm the captain of this ship, I'm the king of this world, you know? It's a very humorous kind of a story. And then Maulana, as he often does, stops the story and turns it to you. and he asks you that question. And children love these kinds of stories. Because first of all, he's talking about a puddle of piss. And anytime you can have piss in a story, that's just awesome. And he asks you, what is your puddle of urine? What is it that you have treated as a whole vast sea, which you have defined and confined the purview of your being to? Whereas if you lift up your glance and you look beyond, you see that there's a whole world beyond it. And then this is why it's helpful to have the commentaries or teachers talk to you about these kinds of stories. When you study these teachings with your sheikh, as I've been fortunate to do, one of the things that they tell you is, remember that the fly, the straw, the puddle of urine, the wind, and the muddy path, these are all inside of you. So yes, you should be able to look within yourself and ask, what about me has been so preoccupied with some limited context or proclaiming himself the king and the queen of the world? And just as in the story, there's a viewer who's watching the fly on the straw, on the puddle of urine, gently laughing at it, smiling at it, what is it in us that could look within our own self with that same smiling generosity? Oh, you poor Omid, you got caught up in your puddle of urine again, didn't you? You acted like that fly again, didn't you? Guess what, Omid Jan? There is a whole world beyond this puddle of urine. Lift up your gaze and look at this vast world, right? And so to realize that all of these tendencies are inside of us, and these stories become practices that one can return to again and again and again, inshallah.
Thank you so much. It's been brilliant, absolutely fascinating. Can you just remind us what your website is for the courses?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is called Illuminated Courses. And if people go on there, here, I'll send it to people right now. And then we hope to have, inshallah, this is a brand new platform that we have been creating. And the overall one is Illuminated Courses. And the first course that is up and running is The Heart of Rumi's Poetry. It's about 7 hours of lectures based on Islamic spirituality as seen through the eyes of Rumi's MASNAVI. And then we're going to have 3 live hours for people to call in with their questions. And inshallah, if it proves successful, we hope to have more courses on Ibn Arabi, on the Quran, on the Sirah, on other things down the road added. Each one of them, really, I don't want to be the only face and voice on them. The hope would be, inshallah, that it would be an opportunity for people that have spent a lifetime with each one of these fields to bring the sweet fruit and share it with people.
Amazing. And also, you know, once the whole corona's phase calms down and travel, you've got some travel programs coming up, haven't you?
Inshallah, we take people to Turkey and Morocco. And, you know, part of the goal has been that these would be opportunities for friends of different faith backgrounds to intellectually and spiritually rejuvenate themselves. And so we meet with artists, we meet with Sufis, we meet with intellectuals and journalists. And then we have discussions every evening so that when we're in Morocco, we're reading Moroccan literature. When we're in Turkey, we're reading Maulana Rumi. I don't want everyone to be always getting the same content no matter where they go. I want to have a sense of the local beauty of the interpretations and lives of Islam.
So we just got a question from another person. I know we're going to finish up on Radical Love. I love that book. It's excellent. Really amazing. But the question was, according to which criteria did you choose the poets and poems in the book? There are many English translations. What is so special about your translation?
Well, alhamdulillah, you know, the funny thing about scholars is that scholars are human beings, and they have not only intellects, but they also have a heart and soul. So there's something I could make up for you about how these poems were found in an ancient manuscript. The truth of the matter is that this is my own love story. My wife and I had a transatlantic, very old-fashioned courtship.
Amazing.
She's a Swiss Muslim, and I'm here in the United States. And for a period of years, the only thing that she ever asked me for was every few days to find a poem or a teaching from the Islamic tradition that really touched my heart, to translate it into a poetic English and send it to her in a letter.
That's amazing.
And then she would read it and she would reflect on it and we would talk about it, and then the next one. And so after a few years, she said, you know, my love, it would be so great if other people could benefit from this. And I was horrified because they're for her. Like, I had no plan of ever having anybody else see these particular renderings. And then she said, well, you gave them to me. I said, yes. She said, and they're mine. I said, yes. And she said, well, if they're mine, then I want you to share them with the world. So quite literally, the process of writing this book was scrolling back through old text messages, cutting and pasting. It's the easiest book I've ever published in my life. I wrote the introduction, and that was that.
What a beautiful story, what a beautiful end.
It's a true story too. You can see in the book, you'll see that it's dedicated to my wife, Corina. And that's an absolutely true story.
Absolutely amazing. Amazing session, Professor. Thank you so much.
Alhamdulillah. Ramadan Mubarak to everyone. May this month be filled with barakah and with grace in these difficult times to you. I know these are challenging times for all of us. And as Maulana Rumi would say, we might be going through a fire right now, but maybe emerge as the Khalil did.
Amazing. And on that note, we wish everyone, inshallah, make dua for us as you break your fast. Those who have broken their fasts already, please, and remember us in your duas during this Ramadan as well. And hope to see you in the next session. Please do contact the professor. Inshallah, you've seen the website. We'll also send you his, if it's okay, we can send you the email addresses as well.
By all means, I would be honored.
Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khairun. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.